Hey guys, Jason here, back with the final TCG Extended deck profile. Today's feature deck is what I consider to be the only true control deck in Season 3, and it's a deck that everyone loves to hate, myself included. It's Deck Out. The deck admittedly changes very little with DM13, but shortly after we completed Season 2, I decided that Slash Charger needed to be on our Hall of Fame, and I thought that this would be a great opportunity to show how Deck Out could adapt to such a restriction. With two of the deck's key cards in Miraculous Snare and Slash Charger being limited to 1, you'd think that the deck would fall down the ranks, but it turns out, even with the nerfs, Deck Out is still one of the strongest decks in the pool. Reconfiguring the deck to account for the loss of Slash Charger was a little tricky. The immense value it brought to the deck meant that I couldn't just do a simple 1-for-1 swap when removing the additional copies. There were quite a few changes I had to make, and I'm really excited to share them with you guys, so let's jump in. Starting off with the most obvious pick, we are playing one copy of Slash Charger. I would say Slash Charger is in the running for the title of Best Card in the deck. The role compression Slash Charger provides in advancing the mill win condition while removing a threat from the opponent's deck and providing a mana boost to unlock power spells quicker is honestly so perfect for Deck Out. Turns out, there's a reason Slash Charger was limited and then banned in the OCG so early on. I do believe that this card is what makes Deck Out an absolute top tier deck in a 40 card format. Even at one copy, I think some people might argue it's still too good, and to that I say, yeah, that's fair. Now, part of what makes Slash Charger so devastating in Deck Out is the ability to reuse it, so to support the one Slash Charger, we are of course playing 4 copies of Belicks the Explorer. I recently mentioned that Slash Charger was in the running for best card in the deck. Well, Belicks, in my opinion, is the other card that can lay claim to that title. The main reason we ran Belicks in the first place was to reuse Slash Charger to deck the opponent faster, and with Slash Charger now being restricted to 1 copy, this concept is even more important than ever. But Belicks also does so much more than that. This is a control deck, and as a result, it runs a whole smorgasbord of spells designed to ruin the opponent's day. We are often forced to charge these early, but that's not really a problem with Belicks around. Being a blocker, Belicks is also a form of protection against aggro, and this trait has oftentimes made a difference. On the subject of defeating aggro decks, the rest of our early game defense is made up of 3 Tajamal, 3 Spiral Gate, and 1 Miraculous Snare. So, Tajamal is back. I think Tajamal is probably the most underappreciated card in the deck, in that its contributions tend to go unnoticed, and many may be quick to suggest replacing it. I'll start by saying that running Belicks as the only cheap blocker isn't really enough to fight off aggro, and while we could use other 3-drop light blockers, I think Tajamal has its merits. He obviously has the benefit of not dying to Judgment, which many decks are running, and he is great at standing up to early drops and fire attackers, which there are many of this format. I would say that the most controversial thing about Tajamal would be his multi-sip status, which tends to act as a double-edged sword. On one hand, this deck can struggle to find light mana sources since we're usually looking to play our light cards, but on the other, charging a Tajamal early is, as we love to say, good for mana. For the early game removal, we're bringing back the old lineup of 3 Spiral Gate and 1 Miraculous Snare. Snare, like Slash Charger, is a card that has been put on the Gauntlet Hall of Fame. Being able to pay 3 mana to essentially remove a creature from the game is extremely strong, especially with a deck like Deck Out around. The Spiral Gates were originally included as stand-ins for what would have been the extra copies of Miraculous Snare, but they do have their own benefits. For one, Spiral Gate can be played a turn earlier than Snare, which can make a pretty big difference, especially when going second. Spiral Gate also has the added benefit of having Shield Trigger, which comes in clutch. In addition, it's a means of reusing Belicks, which given the Slash Charger nerf is really important, but perhaps funniest of all, it can be used to save our own creatures for when we self-board wipe. Speaking of creatures we might want to save from a self-board wipe, making its triumphant return is Narial the Oracle at 2 copies. Over the course of our testing, I found that the combination of Narial and decently sized blockers was extremely oppressive and something many decks could not deal with. I actually wanted to put Narial in our Hall of Fame, but I ultimately decided against it because I figured the stranglehold Narial had was mainly due to the decks in Season 3 happening to not have answers to it, rather than the card itself being overly toxic. For now. Anyway, the takeaway here is Narial is very good in deck out, it can buy a lot of turns by just locking down the board, and it is surprisingly difficult to answer for decks without fire or their own Spiral Gate. This is a control deck, so it should come as no surprise that we are playing 4 copies of Cranium Clamp and 3 copies of Energy Stream. The Gauntlet apparently loves Cranium Clamp, and to be fair, is a really strong card, so this isn't exactly a surprise. Andrew loves to say Cranium Clamp is a 4 or more card, and I feel like to many viewers, Max Clamp in some of our decks is kind of excessive. But this time around, it's the only hand discard we're running, so I do think that the 4 copies here are justified. 3 Stream because it's important for us to have a way to proactively draw cards. Control likes to generate advantage, etc, etc. I think we used to play 4, but had to cut down for reasons I'm about to get into. So, moving on to my favorite part of the deck, we have 3 copies of Volcano Charger, 2 copies of Eureka Charger, 1 copy of Fal, 1 Corpse Charger, 1 Crystal Memory, and 1 Thrash Crawler. The reason this is my favorite part of the deck is because it's where most of the reconfiguration had to happen when making up for the lower Slash Charger count. At first, I thought I could just replace the 2nd and 3rd copies of Slash Charger with Crystal Memory and Future Slash and call it a day, but actually no. I took for granted the extra mana Slash Charger provided, and the deck did not flow very smoothly after my quick fix, so I had to find a way to include more Chargers. Volcano helps boost the fire mana count and acts as a mid-game removal. It of course doesn't work so great against every deck, which is part of the reason why I added Eureka Charger. Eureka, though not particularly aggressive, is still a way to proactively draw cards, and its inclusion was what allowed me to cut down on Energy Stream. The 1 Fal is also new. While unlikely, I felt we needed to at least have the option to retrieve Slash Charger from the graveyard if it were to get discarded. We also run Future Slash, which Fal can recycle, and I'll talk more about that later. Other than that, Fal just does Fal things, but grabbing Slash cards from the graveyard is the main reason it's here. The 1 Corpse and Crystal Memory are back from the previous version. Corpse Charger's main purpose is to grab Belix, or I guess Fal, from the graveyard. Because of Corpse Charger, Belix's dying isn't actually a bad thing, because it's an opportunity to reuse Belix's effect. Also, Corpse can be used to bring back a fallen Narial, which can be very annoying for the opponent. As for Crystal Memory, the search effect usually comes in clutch for control decks such as this, but more importantly, it's a way to search for the one-off Slash Charger. Thrash Crawler is present to act as the 5th copy of Belix. This is necessary because this deck relies on grabbing Slash Charger from the mana zone to reuse it. Thrash was also a card I wanted to play in the other version, but it didn't make the cut, so I'm glad we were able to eventually fit it in. And to finish things off with the big cards, we've got 4 copies of Terror Pit, 2 copies of Judgment, 2 copies of Apocalypse Vice, and 2 copies of Future Slash. Now, is 4 Terror Pit overkill, especially given how many decks in the 40-card format have been cutting down on it? In my opinion, no. I think 4 copies are necessary in deck out because of the card's sheer usefulness. We did try cutting down to 3 Terror Pits, but the difference was very noticeable, especially since we usually want to cast 2 to 3 Terror Pits per game. For a control deck, we actually don't run that many board wipes, which is interesting, but I think between the 4 Terror Pits, the cheap removal, and Narial, this is fine. There is a bit of anti-synergy here, in that Judgment destroys Narial and even Belix, but Judgment has too much upside not to run. In the interest of keeping this discussion brief, I would say that the circumstances in which Judgment and Narial are meant to be used are different. For example, Judgment is best when being swarmed by weenies, while Narial is what deals with the bigger attackers. But every so often, we might be forced to make a tough call on whether to nuke our own board at the cost of the opponent's. In this situation, we just need to keep track of what resources remain, and that we always have a way to access Bellix. Apocalypse Vice is a fantastic board wipe, and 2 copies backed by all the chargers feels just right. As I've said time and time again, the role compression Vice offers in being able to function as a spot removal for a big creature, and a board wipe is simply fantastic. If you notice, we aren't actually running any anti-Petrova cards this time around. Well, between Narial, the ability to slash Petrova out of the deck, and Petrova not being too heavily represented this season, I think this is fine. To finish off, we are running 2 Future Slash to make up for the decreased Slash Charger count. In the OCG, when Slash Charger was limited to 1, it wasn't uncommon for players to run 1 Slash Charger, 1 Future Slash, and 1 Hell Slash. Because we don't have Hell Slash in the card pool, another Future Slash is the next best thing. We initially had 1 Slash Charger, 1 Future Slash, and 1 Lost Soul, but I realized that we needed to up the Future Slash count because there were too many close calls where Deck Out almost couldn't mill the opponent fast enough. The Lost Soul isn't too sorely missed because it wasn't actually doing much most of the time anyway. Here's a nice bird's eye view of the deck. The strategy of the deck is simple: control the opponent out of their mind until they run out of cards. If possible, it's generally good to charge a multi-civ card on turn 1 because it can be a challenge to unlock all civs in a 4-civ deck. Against aggressive decks, we focus on the Spiral Gates, Snare, and Taj Mahal, and against slower decks, it's reasonable to do nothing for the early game until you get to the Streams, Clamps, and Chargers. As the game progresses, it becomes a matter of knowing how well the opposing deck can deal with Narial plus blockers and playing around those outs. For example, if the deck only has spot removal, finding a way to get both Narials out is usually a good idea. Or, if the opposing deck runs Apocalypse Vice, caution must be exercised when deploying creatures because a single Vice can destroy a Taj Mahal, Bellix, and Narial all in one go. In general, it's usually better to prioritize dealing with the opponent's board or hand over milling their deck, but as the deck solidifies its position, it does become a matter of finding ways to slash the opponent as many times as possible. Common plays include Slash Charger and then Bellix to Slash Charger again, Bellix for Future Slash, especially on 9 mana, a late game foul to grab Future Slash, or I guess a removal spell, and Corpse or Spiral Gate to reuse Bellix for either slash card. In terms of matchups, I would say that even with the nerfs, this deck has winning matchups across the board, only potentially losing to the outlier. The combination of Narial plus medium-sized blockers is just such a winning formula, especially in Season 3, though as discussed earlier, running more spell-based removal, particularly fire spells, could decrease the effectiveness of this strategy. In terms of other options, I think there are a couple of mono light blockers that could replace Taj Mahal. Juliana is famously a great anti-aggro card, and I think it would be fantastic in a format without Judgment. There could also be some configuration of Palo Alesis, maybe with Petrova, to make that unbreakable wall. Also, I think Burst Shot and Lost Soul were in the old list. I did find them a bit lacking at times, but their inclusion will also largely depend on what meta you play in. Lastly, Logic Cube is kind of interesting, but I haven't put too much thought into it yet. And for the TCG loyalists, here's a version of the deck that only uses cards from the global release. Since Slash Charger is now in our Hall of Fame, I would say this list is very much the updated version of the list we covered in TCG Explored. In comparison to the TCG Extended version, the 2 copies of Judgment have been replaced by the 3rd Apocalypse Vice and 4th Energy Stream. Judgment is a card that clears the board and draws cards, so I have replaced 1 copy of Judgment with a card that clears the board, and another copy of Judgment with a card that draws cards. And there's the deck. I hope you guys enjoyed our latest coverage of Deck Out with the new restrictions, and more importantly, I hope you guys enjoyed going on the TCG Extended journey with us. It was a heck of a lot of work to put together, but it's something we were happy to be able to bring to you guys. You know, this is going to sound like I'm patting myself on the back, but I really like the changes we made to this deck. I mean, it's still busted, but I feel like it's the most honest deck out list we've covered thus far. In the previous version, I feel like Damien was able to run a bunch of funky cards he liked, and it still dominated. Now, the deck feels a lot tighter on space, and resources feel much more limited, but it is still able to be extremely effective, which I think is how decks should be. Anyway, as always, thank you guys so much for watching, stay safe, and we'll see you guys next time.